please join me in welcoming Dr. Stacy Cordery.
It's really nice to see you all, and it's really great to be here this morning. And I promise I'll go to the microphone in a moment. I just have to get this out of the way because 22 years of my life I've spent here, and I loved every one of them. And I don't want to go to Iowa. I really don't want to leave Monmouth College. We do amazing, incredible work here with students, all of us, we do. And so thank you to all of you who come back. Thank you for your financial support. Thank you for your gifts, from which we all benefit. And I just want you to know that if you're ever in Ames, Iowa, you're all welcome. I have a guest room. If I didn't get that out of the way now, I would have cried later, so I had to do it now. Okay, so it looks like I'm really tech savvy because I have 2 computers, but really I have no clue what I'm doing up here. Can you hear me, Nick? Am I okay? We got our microphone working now? All right, so I want to say thank you to Hannah and to Molly in the development and admissions offices because they helped put this together, and to Donna Sproston, who invited me a long time ago, and to our tech guys who helped with all this stuff, because it takes a lot of work to bring a speaker, even if your speaker's local. So thank you to everybody, and thanks for the introduction, Steve. So yes, I've been devoting pretty much my entire career as a historian to the study of the Roosevelts, Theodore Roosevelt and his family. And one of the things that I like best about Roosevelt is that he is many-sided American, as he's been called. So today I could have talked about Roosevelt, the big game hunter, or Roosevelt, the author, or Roosevelt, the husband and father, or Roosevelt, the environmental conservationist, or Roosevelt, the explorer, Roosevelt, the soldier. There's a million Roosevelts, it feels like, that I could discuss. But in this election season of 2016, and because we as a nation are on the brink of choose your adjective. Exciting? Cataclysmic? Precedent-setting, maybe, presidential election. I thought it might be a really useful thing today if what we did was to consider Theodore Roosevelt in the context of the Republican Party, because first and foremost, Roosevelt is a politician and a Republican politician. So, you know, as a liberal arts professor, what I do is provide context and teach students how to understand context, how to locate context. I teach students how to look at things from all sides, how to view history objectively. And so to put the Republican contender for the presidency in 2016 in a context is a useful, perhaps, and relevant thing that I can do for you, because we also try to make education relevant. So Roosevelt, you know, he never really leaves the news, and politicians from all parties quote him, they call on him, they say, I stand on his shoulders, or I stand in his shadow. Journalists do the same thing. Recently, journalists have been looking back at the 1912 third party run that Roosevelt made, and there might be something interesting there for us to talk about. But of course, Donald Trump has been most recently compared to Theodore Roosevelt. He's been accused of all manner of things where the Republican Party is concerned. And so what I want to do is look at the Republican Party, the phenomenally important part that Roosevelt played in it, and then maybe leave you with enough context to understand what the journalists and what the other politicians say as we move forward towards the election in November. So there's a journalist at Salon.com who said, Trump is not merely a Republican dilemma, but an American tragedy. Republicans must find ways to defend their principles without capitulation to a vulgarian, seemingly without principles of any sort. Okay, so he's saying the Republican Party has principles, but he's not telling us which principles. Here's a direct comparison to Theodore Roosevelt. Speak softly and carry a big stick, and then there's Donald Trump. I'm a historian, and I'm objective, and I'm just going to try to put it in context for you. But so there's a quote from former Utah Governor John Huntsman who said, if Trump prevails, he will have single-handedly upended the old Republican order and built a new movement in its place. Okay, but what is the old Republican order? Which old Republican order? This is what I'm
see our front and center looking just as unhappy as Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, who wasn't even around when the Republican Party was founded, but okay. Jonah Goldberg in the National Review, a conservative paper, said, quote, "Nominating Donald Trump will wreck the Republican Party as we know it." Well, what is the Republican Party as we know it? This is, again, part of what I want to understand. I'm not going to talk about Mr. Trump today, but I do want to provide a context since it's what we do here. So let's start by looking at the roots of the Republican Party. So the Republican Party, as some of you I'm sure know, was founded in 1854 at Ripon, Wisconsin by people who were unhappy with the current political situation. The Republican Party and Theodore Roosevelt were in fact born only 4 years apart. The Republican Party is 1854, Roosevelt was born in 1858. So at the time, the United States was a rural agricultural nation with a booming economy. People were moving westward. America was a haven for immigrants. Almost 400,000 immigrants had arrived in the United States in the 12 months preceding the date that the Republican Party was founded. The biggest trouble that we faced as a country in 1854, of course, was human slavery in the South. And part of the problem was that Northerners and Southerners felt very differently about the idea of slavery. Southerners believed by 1854 that slavery was a positive good. They believed that slavery was a good thing for the economy, a good thing for slaves, and a good thing for masters. However, Northerners believed that that slavery was just evil, plain evil, pure and simple evil. It was a moral burden on a nation that had a better destiny than that. It had to be expunged. Some Northerners feared slavery because as the country moved westward, the idea of slaves moving westward was on everybody's mind, and they worried that slave labor would compete with their own labor in the North and in the West as slavery moved. So they were worried about job competition in that way from basically free labor, right? So in 1854, there were two political parties in the United States. There were the Democrats. The Democrats was the party of small, limited government, white supremacy. This is going to be an easy talk to give. Democrats did not believe in spending the public purse on roads or bridges or canals, which we call internal improvements, nor did they believe that the federal government should ever tell the South what to do about slavery. Meanwhile, the other party was the Whigs. Now, Whigs supported a tariff that would protect American businesses. They wanted a national bank. They wanted federal support for internal improvements. But the Whigs were in trouble because some Whigs were saying the spread of slavery is a bad thing if it goes north and west, and other Whigs said, meh, it's not going to be that big of a deal. So the Whigs had an internal division at this time, and that was part of what allowed the new party to form. But the new Republicans were so good at what they did because they had been active in the Whigs and the Democrats themselves, but that 2 years after their founding, they already had the Speaker of the House of Representatives as a Republican. So they had pretty good organizational abilities. All right, so what happens next is they put forth John C. Fremont as a presidential candidate in 1854, and they lose. But in 1860, the second time they try it, they win the election. Of course, now 1860 was a highly unusual election in this country. Nevertheless, the Republicans win, and they win with this gangly guy who we all love, Abraham Lincoln. The 1860 party platform said slavery in the South would remain untouched, but, and this is sort of a veiled threat, this is a quote from the platform, the normal condition of all the territory of the United States is that of freedom. So they made it very clear, we're not going to touch slavery in the South, but we know where we want to be. The 1860 Republican platform called for a protective tariff. The belief in the tariff was that it would help industry and it would help workers equally. Internal improvement support, the Homestead Law, because the Republicans wanted to see the federal government involved in settling the West. And then they promised that they would build a railroad to the Pacific. So when Lincoln comes in, this is a brand new party, and they do phenomenal things. They got themselves in the middle of a civil war. It's not like we didn't see it coming. But they won it. They won the Civil War. And they destroyed slavery. And they gave real political rights to African Americans. This was an astounding accomplishment. And basically they could have folded up shop because they pretty much did everything that they said they were going to do when they founded. But they went on. They established a banking system and an income tax because wars are expensive, so governments expand in wars. They created the Department of Agriculture. They started land-grant colleges to educate the children of farmers. They did pass the Homestead Act, and that helped for the orderly settlement of the West. The federal government sold that money went into its coffers because they believed in a big and activist federal government. And they did make good on their promise to the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, all these things that the Republican Party did became associated in the public mind with business. So very early on, the Republican Party's got an association with business. So then a terrible thing happens, as you know. When President Lincoln is assassinated, it has an enormous effect on the brand new Republican Party. Lincoln becomes deified, and the Republican Party begins to call itself right then and there the Party of Lincoln, to make that connection very clear. And when he's assassinated by a Democrat, then the Republicans get to say, well, we have the moral high ground here. We're the ones who wanted to get rid of slavery. You're the ones who killed our president. So this begins very early, this sense that the Republican Party has the moral high ground, as I said. And this is never going to quite leave the Republican Party. Democrats come to be seen as treasonous and unpatriotic by the Republican Party. Also something that some historians think doesn't really ever leave the Republican Party, even to today. The Republicans in Congress will pass the 14th and 15th Amendments. Again, this is something that's difficult to quibble with. The 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment gave them citizenship. The 15th Amendment gave freed men, not women, the right to vote. So there is a sense by the time Lincoln is assassinated that the party is the country and the country is the party. They're the same thing. Now we're going to skip through the long Gilded Age, which is actually what I study, so it always pains me to skip through the Gilded Age. We're going to do it. So I just want you to see how strong the Republicans are. 1860, Lincoln's elected. 1864, he's reelected. 68, Grant serves 2 terms. Hayes serves a term. Garfield is assassinated. Arthur serves out his term. Harrison serves a term. McKinley serves 2 terms. Well, a term and a bit. He's assassinated. But there's only this one Democrat in there, Cleveland. And he is the only Democrat who can crack the Republican control of the White House. So what do Republicans stand for in the Gilded Age, which is 1876 to 1901 is the Gilded Age? They're going to maintain their belief in an activist federal government. They're going to continue to oversee Western development and internal improvements. They will pass some effective tariffs. They believe in a gold standard. In the Gilded Age, there are 2 depressions, 1873 and 1893. And both times these depressions occur, Americans will say, we need more money, let's coin silver, let's back our paper money with silver as well as gold. The Republicans are basically going to stand firm and say, nope, we're not doing that. They're going to professionalize the civil service. The civil service professionalization is about political corruption. Civil service, obviously, these are people who work for the federal government. If I am president, I can put my best friend Molly in as the collector of the Port of New York, just because she's my best friend. She may never have been to New York or could locate it on a map, but it didn't matter because she was my best friend. So professionalizing civil service meant we can't pick Molly because she was not any good at the job. Sorry, Molly. But we have to pick somebody who knows something about, ships and ports and customs. So this was an effort, a very long effort through the Gilded Age, but it was about corruption in politics. And then the continuation of overseeing the nation's morals. So Benjamin Harrison, that man in front of you there with the serious mien, he said, quote, "The Republican theory has been all along that it was right to so legislate as to provide work, employment, and comfort to the American working man. We believe that the national government has a duty in this respect." Meanwhile, Democratic President Grover Cleveland said in his inaugural address in 1893, quote, "While the government should while the people should patriotically and cheerfully support their government, its functions do not include the support of the people." So, foreign policy of the Republicans in the Gilded Age. The country is, both Democrats and Republicans are fairly isolationist and internal looking until we get to the Spanish-American War in 1898. And then there is a division, and the Democrats basically say, we don't really want to get in. The Democrats say it's okay to fight Spain on Cuba's behalf, but we don't want to get involved past that. And the Republicans say it's okay to fight Spain on Cuba's behalf, and it's okay to look at other Spanish colonies, like the Dominican Republic, like the Philippines, and so forth. So that hand Destiny, handing to Colombia and Uncle Sam the children of Manifest Destiny. In that case, it would be the Dominican Republic and Cuba and the Philippines and so forth. So the Republicans under McKinley begin to assume the mantle of international leadership. And this is a little bit different from what we've seen in the past. All right, this gets us to my man, Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt, I'm sure his story is pretty well known to many of you. Born in 1858, as I said, to a Southern mother and a Yankee father. He was born into a wealthy family with a sense of noblesse oblige. Duty was the watchword of every Roosevelt, male, female, through many generations. Duty towards those who were less fortunate. Their family motto was along the lines of, to whom much is given, much is expected. And so this is partly why Roosevelt will be accused of selling out his class later, because he's going to be looking out for the people who can't look out for themselves rather than his buddies in the, in the elite class. Roosevelt will have this lovely family, and the one I study is the one in the hat, of course. Who else was center stage but Alice? And he will he'll have a difficult childhood himself. I think some of you must know he grew up sickly and asthmatic, had to make his body, as he said. He grew up to be a very charismatic, thoughtful, well-read, public-spirited man. He had interests that ranged from Nordic poetry to human flight. He cared about biology and literature and government and international relations. He cared about big game hunting, social Darwinism. There's hardly a subject that did not interest Theodore Roosevelt. One subject that never interested Theodore Roosevelt was music. Drove his wife crazy. She loved music. He was tone deaf, didn't care. Roosevelt was going to write some 35 books by the time he falls off his perch. He believed in growth. He believed in big business as the future of the country. He believed in expansion. He believed that the United States had to take its place on the world stage. He graduated from Harvard Phi Beta Kappa. I told you he was a smart guy. He was the youngest man ever to serve in the New York State Assembly from 1882 to 84, and he began as a young man fighting corruption. He fought political corruption. He fought corporate corruption. He was known as a kind of a morally upright young man who was going to set the world on fire. He was dedicated to rooting out corruption because it was part of that duty. It was a good thing to do. As you know, I'm sure his mother and his wife died on Valentine's Day in 1884. As a result of that, he decided he had to go away to the ranch that he had already bought in the Dakotas, so he spent time in the West. Very significant effect on him. He was a rancher. He wrote some books out there. I say he's a rancher because he always would tell you he was not a cowboy. Because the ranchers were the bosses, the cowboys. He was the boss. And his cowboys called him Mr. Roosevelt. They never called him Theodore. He was a sheriff. He was a part-time sheriff out there, and he was also an organizer. He organized the other cattlemen into basically a cattlemen's organization to get some work done out there. So he had a lot of different experiences. He came back to Washington, D.C., married Edith Kermit Carew, his childhood sweetheart, served as civil service commissioner, again, fighting corruption, this time corruption in the Republican Party. He went to become New York City Police Commissioner, loved that job. He loved that job. He had a great time, even though his wife hated being back in New York. He thought it was just great fun. And he did good work. For example, Roosevelt said, you know what, tell me, why is it that the New York City Police Force, some of the officers don't have guns, and none of them have matching guns? And then he discovered that those police officers, they had never been trained in shooting. So Roosevelt set up basically the first police academy, and he drilled the men, and he trained them in all sorts of ways, including he imposed a height limit, not a limit, the opposite. If you were too short, you couldn't be a police officer. So you had to be a certain height to be a police officer. You had to have some stature in the community. He put them all in uniforms. They weren't all uniformed either. So Roosevelt did great things there. He became Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897, and that's the job he, of course, quit to enter the Spanish-American War. I think it's important to point out that Roosevelt didn't just up one day and say, gosh, it would be great to be a soldier, off I go. He had served in the New York National Guard from 1882 to 86, and he had been the company commander for the last 2.5 years. So he did have some knowledge of the military, at least, before he went off to fight in He did not want to become President McKinley's vice president. A later vice president, John Nance Garner, will say, the vice presidency is not worth a bucket of warm spit. And while that's anachronistic, Roosevelt would have felt about the same way. So he did not want to go into nowhere's land as the VP. But he did it for his party because it was duty, right? It was part of his duty. So McKinley had been elected in 1896 as the advance agent of prosperity because he promised that he would end the Depression of 1893. That's why you see prosperity above their heads there. When McKinley was elected in 1896, 78% voter turnout of eligible voters. 78%. The United States of America was becoming much more urbanized. Immigration continued to flow after the Civil War. We were much more industrialized, so the immigrants were coming to work in the factories in America. This is the era of the jungle and so forth, So it was a different party. The Republican voters at the time that McKinley and Roosevelt were running consisted of northern city dwellers, prosperous farmers, industrial workers, and most ethnic groups, but not the Irish. They couldn't get the Irish in because of the moral, right? The moral aspects of the party said, we want Sunday closings for liquor, right? We don't want any taverns open on Sunday. We want schools to be teaching in English and not other languages, so this affected some German Lutherans. But they could never quite get the Irish. But all African Americans voted Republican because Lincoln freed the slaves and Lincoln was Republican, so African Americans voted Republican. And frankly, the Republican Party did more for African Americans than the Democrats ever did in all these years. So the majority of the nation, except for the Solid South, is Republican throughout the whole Gilded Age up until this time as well. So what do they believe in, these two? This will sound familiar. High effective tariffs mean national prosperity. Overseas expansion, they're still on board with that. All ethnic groups are welcome in the party. Civil service reform is still necessary. Now by 1900, regulation of businesses might be necessary. Maybe. McKinley wasn't so sure. Roosevelt had an opinion. So the Republicans have to oversee the nation's morals. Again, just a standard part of the party. Well, what happens next, as you know, is that President McKinley is assassinated. When that happens, Roosevelt, as Mark Hanna once said before they put him in as VP, don't you realize there's only one life between the presidency and that madman? So now that madman, Theodore Roosevelt, becomes president. His ideas are called the square deal. He uses the term square deal. It comes from the anthracite coal strike, where he says he wants the government to be an honest broker. And so for the first time in the anthracite coal strike, the President of the United States is going to see labor unions on par with the owners, business owners. And it wasn't that long ago that President Cleveland, remember, mowed down the striking workers. So Roosevelt's going to bring them to the negotiating table. That's a really big difference. Okay, so Roosevelt is going to believe in an activist federal government, and he believes that only through the federal government's work can we bring all citizens to prosperity. So he's going to bust those trusts. That's what he believes. The government should regulate businesses, and he's going to do it. Although Theodore Roosevelt, being Theodore Roosevelt, says there are good trusts and there are bad trusts. Well, Mr. President, what's the difference? I know the difference. It had to do with trust. Bad trust harmed the public, and good trust didn't. But nobody could ever get him to pin him down any more than that. Railroad regulation, he passed 3 major railroad regulation bills. The railroads were America's biggest business, and Roosevelt wanted to make sure that industry understood that the government was bigger than any business. That was one of the first things he did when he got into office, was to press that point home. You all know about the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Again, using the power of the government on behalf of Americans who cannot help themselves. One of the first things Roosevelt did when he got into office was to invite Booker T. Washington to have dinner at the White House. Washington ate with the family, so this is a fake picture. I mean, it's really from the time, but it's not really what happened. But you can see Abraham Lincoln. Oh no, you can't see anything. Abraham, see this two-computer thing. Abraham Lincoln looking on and pleased with what he's seeing, that Roosevelt's got this African-American man eating at the White House in a position of equality. This was enormous. And Roosevelt got a slew of telegrams from Southerners calling for his impeachment. Yeah. Okay, agreement with Japan because he felt that Japanese were being treated unfairly on the West Coast, so he's going to work out an immigration deal with the Japanese. Before you think too highly of Roosevelt for immigration, he really thought the Japanese were an up-and-coming people, but he did not like the Chinese at all, so he'll participate in stopping Chinese immigration to the country, but he will encourage some limited Japanese immigration. He's going to ignore the tariff because it bores him. It's big, it's complicated. He went to law school, but then he dropped out because law school bored him. So, tariff, he's going to leave that to the people who come after him. He will use the power of the federal government in the Newlands Reclamation Act to try to make sure that there's enough water out west for the people who are moving west. He's going to, as you know, be our greatest environmental president. Actually, that's not true because Taft is going to set aside more land for conservation than Roosevelt will. But Roosevelt gets the nod. And he will consider campaign finance reform. No, he didn't call it that then. But Roosevelt was deeply bothered by the long fingers of corporations in politics. So he wanted to think about ways to end that. And he's going to endorse an inheritance tax. This is one of the ways that he'll be accused of selling out his class. Okay, he's going to have an activist foreign policy. This should not surprise you at all. Speak softly and carry a big stick, he would say. He will go far. I won't go through this whole thing, but I will just remind you that the Russo-Japanese peace settlement, when he brokered that war, Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. What we know him for in terms of foreign policy is the Panama Canal, a thing which was widely applauded at the time and will come under great scrutiny a little bit later. So Henry Kissinger, of all people, said, Roosevelt was the first president to insist that it was America's duty to make his influence felt globally. McKinley did not really want to get involved in the Spanish-American War because McKinley had fought in the Civil War and McKinley didn't want to see Americans die in the battlefield. So he really dragged his feet about this. So I think that Kissinger's influence here is that it's America's duty to get involved is part of it. So what's going to happen is that Roosevelt will try to move the GOP to the left. Now, he wouldn't have phrased it that way, but this is how we would understand it today. So how is he going to do this? He's going to do this by trying to limit corporate power in politics, by regulating business, by doing things that make business really unhappy, like curbing child labor. So regulating business is great if you're a taxpayer, a citizen, or maybe an employee, but maybe not so great if you own the corporation. So Roosevelt's business regulation is going to make business owners very suspicious. Roosevelt's going to call for a minimum wage and maximum hour laws in some select industries like mining and railroading, which are dangerous industries. He's going to call for workers' unemployment comp. He's going to call for inheritance and income taxes. He's going to ask initially for judicial review. This means if you've got a judge sitting who makes decisions with which the population around him disagrees, you should be able to recall that judge. Okay, this he backpedaled from pretty quickly because the Supreme Court particularly, but also other levels of justice, this was considered fairly sacrosanct at the time. So Roosevelt said, the people should be the ones to decide, and mostly Republicans and a lot of Democrats said, yeah, but not with the court. I tell my students this, and then we talk about Franklin Roosevelt and the Supreme Court packing scheme, and I say, here's just a world tip for you all. If you ever get to be president, leave the court alone. So these other things you see, right? IRR, old age pensions, medical insurance. Medical insurance. Roosevelt came up with medical insurance first. All done by a strong activist government. These are the ways that Roosevelt tried to move the party to the left, because Roosevelt believed that the idea of a nation divided into two parties, one, this is a quote from him, containing the bulk of the property owners and conservative people, and the other, the bulk of the wage workers and less prosperous people generally, was a bad idea. He did not want to see a nation divided by class, by money, by opportunity. So he really believed in creating the square deal, and the way he did it was going to involve corporate America. So Roosevelt believed the federal government had to curb corporate power. The federal government had to clean up politics. The federal government was the only entity in America big enough to make sure that Americans who could not help themselves could be helped. Of course, not all Republicans agreed with this. So we're going to get then to the 1912 election, where President Taft is going one way with the Republican Party, and former President Roosevelt is going the other way with the Republican Party. You can see they're wearing the GOP brand trousers, that's what that little sign says. And it says this way to the nomination. So how do we get there? Well, you know, the 1912 election is when Theodore Roosevelt decides, for a number of reasons, that he has to create his own party. So he creates the Progressive Party. What you're looking at is Teddyism, the water of Teddyism, and the guy in the holding onto the elephant, the GOP elephant trunk, is Theodore Roosevelt. And he's trying to pull the Republican Party into Teddyism, and the guy in brown behind the elephant, that's Taft, trying to make sure that he pulls the Republican elephant out of the waters of Teddyism. So what happens in 1912 is a whole, like, I teach a class on that all semester, so that's a really long story. But by and large, the result in 1912, when Roosevelt leaves the Republican Party, is that he takes all the creative energy out of the party, all the progressive impetus out of the party. It all goes with him. And so, as a result of the sort of this openness to new ideas, this belief in reform, this belief in regulation, it goes, unhappily, some of these people go off to the Democratic Party, Woodrow Wilson. But most of them do not come back to the Republican Party. And so this gives us, Roosevelt's leaving the party in 1912, gives us the party of, the Republican Party of the 1920s, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, and those are the men in charge when we get to the Great Depression, right, which is this line, why can't you give my dad a job? You can't give my dad a job because you, as the Republican Party, believe that the role of the government has changed since 1854, since 1901. So, the Republicans of the 1920s are a very different entity. In the 1920s, Republican Party believed in an isolationist foreign policy, but to be fair, so do the Democrats. Most all Americans after World War I believe in isolationism. But the Republican Party is going to oppose American entry into the League of Nations and will successfully keep us out of the League of Nations, of course. The Republicans of the 1920s believed the government should be small. It should have a small budget. It should be less active. It should not be doing stuff. They looked at all the things that Woodrow Wilson did in World War I and said, yeah, we don't like that big activist government because wars expand governments, right? And so Republicans after World War I said, we don't want that. We don't like what Wilson and the Democrats did. They're going to put their emphasis on business. You all know Coolidge saying the business of the American people is business. They're not going to regulate business as Republicans. They're going to lower taxes. They're going to concentrate on balancing the budget. They're going to decrease the power of labor unions, and they're no longer going to be champions of African American equality. So those things in red, those are changes, pretty significant changes from what we've seen after Theodore Roosevelt walks out of the party. Warren Harding, President Harding said, we need, quote, a nation where childhood had a right to happiness, motherhood to health, everyone to education, and all Americans the right to our equal opportunity. But the Republican Party in the 1920s believed it was no longer their job to supply these wants or to regulate the behavior of Americans to bring about social justice. This is the big switch. This now sounds like that Grover Cleveland quote. Okay, so then we get to the Great Depression and all those many years of Franklin Roosevelt. Right? I wrote a book about Alice Roosevelt. She said, down the river we saw nemesis Franklin Roosevelt, right? So many people, most people really loved Franklin Roosevelt. But his party said, our hands are not tied and we will experiment, right? There's Dr. New Deal, we'll try all these different remedies. If they don't work, we'll try another one. But many Republicans were very unhappy with Roosevelt, and the chief things they didn't like was this large activist government, particularly a government that created permanent changes like Social Security. They didn't like the sympathy for organized labor that Franklin Roosevelt, the Democrats had. Deficit spending. Okay, Franklin Roosevelt frankly didn't like deficit spending either, but he believed it was necessary when the people were so troubled by the economy. And Franklin Roosevelt went out and wooed African Americans. Like, he went out and wooed them. And it worked. And it was Franklin Roosevelt who convinced African American voters in this country to vote away from the party of Lincoln and towards the Democratic Party. It was calculated and purposeful, and so that's a big change. Ethnic Americans are going to move in the Democratic Party, and thanks to Franklin Roosevelt and union members, he will court again with some really pro-union legislation, which will convince them to go in the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party will grow in size from people who were traditionally Republican. So it's in the 1920s then that the Grand Old Party, GOP was a nickname given to it in the 1870s. The Grand Old Party abandoned its 19th century faith in national power and began to embrace states' rights, smaller government, and a presence through limited powers. So this is problematic for some folks. This is Eisenhower, as you know, who embraced what he called modern republicanism in the 1950s. In 1956, the GOP platform called, again, limited federal action, smaller federal government, although Eisenhower personally said he thought the president should have a lot of power. Eisenhower said to all the conservative Republicans in his party, we cannot get rid of Social Security. We can't do it. He said, we can't get rid of the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's here to stay. It's still here. He said, we can't dismantle these programs that Franklin Roosevelt began because the people depend upon them too much. So we're going to tell the world that instead of dismantling them, we're going to perfect them. That's what the Republicans were going to do. Not dismantle Franklin Roosevelt's programs, but to perfect them. And so that became a challenge for the Republican Party. The GOP is going to concentrate on balancing the budget and reducing the national debt. And they're going to call for a big change now for the Republicans, low tariffs. Because by the 50s and the Cold War years, the world has changed. We're in this new world of free trade, and so a tariff is less of an issue than it has been for Republicans all those decades back. As some of you might know, now President Eisenhower believed in rational military spending, and he literally kept the lid on military spending, even though he could have exploded it. But he had been there and thought he knew a better way to do it. Some people give him a lot of credit for keeping down military spending at the time. And then, I'm going to just pop this in here because I haven't really talked about women. The Republican Party was, since 1920, the foremost supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment. Women were given the vote in 1920, the 19th Amendment, and the Republican Party arguably was more open to women voters than the Democratic Party was. But the Democratic Party did a better job of including women in the party proper. So there were many more women working under the aegis of the Democratic Party, many more females elected at the local levels as Democrats than as Republicans. But it was really the Republicans who sponsored the ERA year after year after year after year, and so they're going to put it on their Republican Party platform for a long time. And so that was important to just stick in there for you. Okay, then the 60s happened. Well, you know, the 60s changed everything. I teach a course on that too. When you get to the 1960s, by which I really mean like 1963 to 1975, that's really the 60s. We're in the middle of the Cold War, and so the Republican Party stands really firm with anti-communism. That's one of the main things that the GOP is going to insist upon. They are more anti-communist than the Democrats are, and there's a whole history of that goes back to Truman, but the Democrats are always left scrambling, saying, yes, we are anti-communist, yes, we will fight a strong fight. It's always the Republicans who seem to have the edge on foreign policy in this era. Republicanism in the 1960s is very much pro-states' rights, small government, limited power, and they're very fearful of the nation's moral future because the 60s are here. And so in the 1960s, late 60s, the Republican Party will recommit to this idea of being the nation's moral guardians. And it's a big part of what draws new voters to the party. Leading the charge in some of this is Barry Goldwater. Now, Goldwater is going to back away from civil rights. By the 60s, he's decided Lyndon Johnson in the 60s has done everything Johnson can do and the Democrats can do for African Americans. The 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, and Barry Goldwater says a variation of, I'm not going to go fishing when I know there's no fish in the fishing hole. So he said, I'm not even going to try to bring African Americans back in. They're gone. Let them go. Barry Goldwater will call for prayer in public spaces. He wants to keep Social Security. Again, they're working on perfecting it. He's going to want to reduce government spending. He's going to call for letting communist China into the United Nations as a way to essentially convert them. He figures if you can let them into the, into the party, eventually we'll win them over. And of course, strengthening the U.S. military is part of that as well. Now, a few years ahead, Richard Nixon's party, Nixon's a complicated man and a very powerful Republican and a really important piece of our political history as a nation for many, many, many years. What I want to draw your attention to where Richard Nixon is concerned is not so much his policies, because they were pretty much of piece with what we see with the Republicans, the rest Republicans in this era. But Richard Nixon, behind the scenes, is working on some very important things that will pay off for the Republican Party. He's going to gather a whole staff of people who are very, very good at some things. For example, figuring out what message Americans want to hear in the 60s. So Richard Nixon's going to get a group of people who begin to do some targeted messaging, and they're going to test what Americans are hearing and how Americans receive it. And this kind of data gathering will be very important to the Republican Party going forward. Herbert Hoover in the 1920s had what was called a Southern strategy of moving away from support for African Americans and playing instead to affluent whites in the South. Richard Nixon will actually call it a Southern strategy, and he will go sort of full bore to bring in white Southerners. And it's important because in the 60s, we've got the beginnings of air conditioning and that flight of mostly white Americans to the South. So the demographics of the Republican Party is going to shift about this time, and we'll see a big movement to the South. Richard Nixon gets together some people who are brilliant fundraisers, and the fundraising they do begins with tiny little sums of money. This may sound familiar. Tiny little sums of money, but lots of people giving lots of sums, little bits of money, right? And he's also going to work very carefully with corporations to find ways that corporations can donate money to the GOP. All this will create a deep pool of very seasoned political operatives. I don't mean operatives negatively or pejoratively. I mean, these are people who know their way around Washington and who understand how to get to voters. And this was part of Nixon's brilliance that people don't talk about. On the other hand, Nixon believed that Democrats were really, truly active opponents to America, active opponents to American values. This goes right back to the party of Lincoln. Right? Democrats somehow unpatriotic. Democrats don't really deserve to rule the country. Democrats are not strong enough in terms of foreign policy. There are all kinds of ways that Nixon was suspicious of Democrats. Nixon was suspicious of a lot of people. This is part of Nixon's character. But all this together pays off for Republicans in the Reagan era, because they reap the benefits of Nixon's political operatives. So we get new Republicans in the Reagan era. The 1960s again brings in social conservatives who say, I've had enough of feminism. I've had enough of gay rights and prisoners' rights and African American rights and all the other people who wanted rights, right? Asian power, red power, black power, brown power. Many social conservatives said enough is enough. And so they moved out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party. The moral majority is going to arise around this time. Jerry Falwell and other folks like him will begin to court people to move into the Republican Party. Catholics by this time will move in because of Roe versus Wade in 1973. So Catholics will make common cause with evangelical Protestants because of abortion. And then there's a group of neocons, new conservatives, who were all former Democrats, and these neocons, very intellectual, very smart people, and they are unhappy with some of the more liberal aspects of the Democratic Party, so they move into the Republican Party as well. Plus, what happens in the Reagan era is there are some new fundraising rules which really help out the Republican Party, and some of you may remember Richard Viguerie and his direct mail campaigns. Very, very savvy direct mail ideas coming out of the Reagan era. So we're going to have a lot of people voting for this man. Funny story. I was looking for a picture to put up here about Ronald Reagan. And you know, every picture I can find, you Google him and try this. He's smiling in every one. Everyone. The man smiles in every picture. It's really hard to find a serious picture. Not serious. Sorry?
He's got a good handler.
Yes, he had many good handlers. He did way back in California. But I find a picture of him not smiling. I did find one. It's on the next slide. So Ronald Reagan is, though I'm sure all of you, except some of you standing against the wall there, know, Ronald Reagan believed that the government was too big, too expensive. He wanted government off our back. He said the government taxes way too much, brings in too much money. Government shouldn't have that much money, he believed. Shouldn't have so much money that would tempt it to do activist things. He said some federal programs should just be eliminated, and it's going to take a strong leader like me to figure out which ones should be eliminated. He said tariffs have to go. Tariffs hurt business. We should deregulate. We should deregulate all kinds of industries, and we saw that mostly with air traffic controllers, right? But there are many other examples of deregulation in the Reagan era. They called for a balanced budget. That's not going to quite happen. Reaganites wanted to. Oh, I just did something bad. There we go. Reaganites wanted to defund, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency. That was one of the agencies he believed had nothing good going for it. Interesting because of Theodore Roosevelt's strong connection to environmentalism. But some things you have to have a strong government for if you're Ronald Reagan. For example, the war on drugs. The war on drugs called for, more federal oversight, more money, more intervention. So I'm speaking, in a 45-minute talk, so I'm leaving a lot out and speaking in shorthand. So if you're now, I know I'm in the era that you all lived through. So if you're out there going, I don't know, Stacy, I'm going to claim I don't have a lot of time to go into detail. In terms of foreign policy, Ronald Reagan, there he is, looking patriotic but not smiling. The United States was losing the battle against the Soviet Union. He felt this very, very strongly, that the United States was really losing the battle. And so the Democrats had to leave the White House, leave Congress, so it would free him up to fight the battle against communism. And so we should bring back our nuclear defense, refund the nuclear program, build up all our defenses. And so this was very much a part of his foreign policy. It was a very short, sweet, concise message, and he never veered from it. All right, so by the 1980s, these Republicans were white, male conservatives. They were pro-business and anti-government. They were suspicious of regulation. Almost all of them were evangelical Protestants. They were states' rights advocates who were uninterested in minority rights, uninterested in immigration, interventionist in foreign policy, and living now in the South, the West, and the Midwest. Kind of a change, too. So Donald Trump told CNN about a little bit ago, the last time he thought America was great was at the turn of the 20th century and in the late 1940s and 50s. So that would be in Theodore Roosevelt's era and in Eisenhower's era. And you're going to ask me why doesn't he like Reagan? He said, I don't like Reagan because of NAFTA. So I just want to sort of make a chart to help you understand what we're looking at in terms of the changes in the Republican Party. So before Theodore Roosevelt's era, the notion that the Republican Party had to be the moral guardian of the United States involved these things, right? Before the 1920s, the Republican Party wanted to outlaw slavery, guarantee civil rights for all Americans. It was in favor of prohibition, English language teaching, Sunday closings, and the Republicans of the Gilded Age really wanted to end prostitution. They had very creative ways to do that. In the 1980s, the idea that the Republican Party should be the moral guardian of the nation continues, and possibly up to today, right, in 1980s and beyond. The Republican Party is the party that is opposed to abortion. It fought the war on drugs in the Reagan era. It opposed gay rights, pornography. It wanted to stop the ERA now. That happened with Phyllis Schlafly and her movement called Stop ERA. It's very successful. We do not have an equal rights amendment in this country in large measure because Phyllis Schlafly was an extremely brilliant tactician. But this notion of morals for the Republican Party has maintained all throughout. So here's some other components. In Roosevelt's era, it was a strong activist government, and after Roosevelt, the Republican Party believes in a small, limited government. In Roosevelt's era, protective tariffs were important because they helped, it was the best thing for that era to help both workers and business owners. In the 1920s and later, the Republican Party will be all pro-business and less about workers. In TR's era, governmental regulation protected the people, and that's why it was important. But in the 1920s and later, the party will move towards deregulation. Interventionist foreign policy in Roosevelt's time, yeah, isolationism in the 1920s, but again, to be fair, everybody was isolationist in the 1920s, but certainly interventionism today. Roosevelt wanted to fund social programs. Today, there are fewer dollars dedicated to funding social programs as a part of the Republican Party's ideology. And in Roosevelt's time, support for labor unions So today, you know, the Republican Party wants to reduce taxes, spend more on defense, turn programs like Social Security and Medicare into voluntary programs. That was George Bush's idea. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you hear, well, let me be clear, you can't help but hear. When you hear people in the upcoming months talk about the Republican Party and Donald Trump and what he stands for and how he compares to Roosevelt or to Eisenhower or to Reagan, I think it's important that we as citizens in this democracy have an understanding of the context, because context is what we do here in this liberal arts college, provide the context, help you with the context. So I don't have a way to wrap this up in a pretty bow, and I'm not going to, you know, tell you where I'm at where this election is concerned. But I hope that what I could do this morning is give you a larger sense of the Republican Party, because to paraphrase, I've lost the name of the movie, you can tell me, but I just feel like we all should say to one